On the evening of April 17th, 1987, 3 hours before the first drop of rain touched Jefferson County, Missouri, 72-year-old Walter Grady nailed plywood across the lower windows of the Miller Feed Supply beside Highway 21 and told every man inside to move their trucks uphill before midnight. Nobody listened. The feed store smelled like wet seed sacks, diesel fuel, and burnt coffee. A Cardinals game crackled softly through an old radio hanging beside the cash register, while 6 younger farmers stood around a rusted barrel stove laughing at Walter's warning. Outside, the sky still looked harmless, pale gray, flat, calm enough for spring planting. Then Walter said the river would climb 12 feet before dawn. That was when Dean Holloway laughed. Not polite laughter. Real laughter. Loud enough to stop the room. Dean was 38 years old, owner of Holloway Excavation, vice chairman of the county planning board, and proud driver of a brand new 1987 Ford F-250 with polished chrome wheels that had seen more wax than mud. He spent most county meetings talking about satellite forecasts, computerized drainage models, and why older farmers relied too much on instinct. Walter stood quietly near the coffee counter, wearing a faded brown coat and cracked leather gloves. He never raised his voice. "Move your trucks," he said again. Dean shook his head slowly. "Walter, the National Weather Service says maybe 2 inches. Walter looked toward the window. "That river's already talking." More laughter. Somebody muttered that old age had finally reached him. But Walter Grady had farmed the same 412 acres outside DeSoto since 1949. He knew the big river the way some men know family. He knew its smell before flood. He knew the silence birds carried before heavy water arrived. And he knew exactly what the clay banks looked like when the ground underneath started giving way. Let me tell you about Walter Grady. He was born in December of 1914 during one of the coldest Missouri winters on record. His father raised draft horses in sorghum near Valles Mines long before diesel tractors became common. Walter served in Europe during World War II, came home with a limp in his left leg, married Eleanor Price in 1947, and bought his first tractor 2 years later, a 1949 Farmall M, 44 horsepower, 5,300 pounds, bought used in St. Francois County for $1,800. That machine sat inside Walter's equipment shed almost 40 years later, still painted red beneath layers of grease and dust. Walter changed the oil every 80 operating hours, whether he could afford it or not. He kept spare belts hanging on nails beside the workbench. The original steel toolbox still sat beneath the seat exactly where it had been mounted in Rock Island, Illinois. Most men in Jefferson County called it outdated. Walter called it dependable. The rain started at 8:14 p.m. Hard, not spring rain, flood rain, the kind that sounds heavy even through barn roofs. Dean Holloway watched it from the feed store porch with his arms crossed. He still looked confident. Younger men often do before nature removes the illusion that confidence matters. Walter stepped down from the porch slowly. "You've got maybe 4 hours," he said. Dean smirked. "For what?" Walter looked toward town. "For people to start praying." Then he climbed into his 1973 Chevrolet C20 pickup and drove north toward his farm. Nobody followed him. By 10 o'clock, drainage ditches were overflowing. By 11, Highway 21 had standing water. At 11:47 p.m., the sheriff's office received its first emergency call from a family trapped near Mammoth Road. Dean Holloway still thought the old man was exaggerating. Until midnight. That was when the power failed. The lights inside the Holloway house vanished instantly. The furnace stopped humming. Rain hammered the roof like gravel. Dean stepped onto the porch with a flashlight and finally heard it. Water. Fast water. Not rainfall. River water. He drove toward town and saw headlights floating sideways beneath the bridge near Platten Creek. Then he saw something worse. Walter Grady's Farmall M moving through the darkness with chains dragging behind it. The old tractor was heading straight toward town. And behind the wheel sat Walter himself, wearing the same calm expression he had worn while everyone laughed at him inside the feed store. Dean watched the tractor disappear into the storm. Then the river climbed over the road. At 1:22 a.m., the emergency sirens finally sounded across DeSoto. By then it was already too late for dozens of families living near the low ground east of town. Water poured through streets that had been dry less than an hour earlier. Mailboxes vanished. Trash barrels floated into fences. Entire sections of gravel road dissolved beneath black moving water. Rain continued falling in sheets so thick the sheriff's deputies could barely see their own headlights. But Walter Grady had seen this before. Not exactly this storm. Storms are never identical. But he had seen rivers betray confident men before. In the spring of 1973, he watched floodwater destroy 200 acres of corn near Festus after county officials ignored warnings from older farmers. In 1951, he saw the Mississippi rise high enough to swallow barns in Cape Girardeau County. And when he was 11 years old, his father taught him something he never forgot. When frogs go silent before rain, his father said, "Move the animals uphill." That afternoon in April of 1987, the frogs had gone silent. Let me tell you about the machine Walter trusted most. That Farmall M had worked nearly every acre he owned. Built in Rock Island, Illinois. The tractor carried a 4-cylinder engine with enough low-end torque to pull heavy loads through mud where newer tractors sometimes spun helplessly. Modern equipment had more horsepower on paper, but old machines like the Farmall delivered power differently. Slow, steady, relentless. There's a difference between horsepower and torque that many people misunderstand. Horsepower measures how quickly work gets done. Torque measures turning force. Old farm tractors mattered because they produced strong torque at low engine speed. That meant they could keep pulling under brutal resistance without constantly shifting gears or overworking the engine. Cast iron engine blocks also handled heat differently than lighter modern designs. They were heavy and inefficient by modern standards, but incredibly durable. Farmers trusted them because they were built to survive abuse instead of avoiding it. Walter knew exactly what that machine could do, and he needed every ounce of it. By 2 a.m, he had already pulled 3 stranded vehicles from floodwater near Miller Creek. Families climbed into the wagon behind the Farmall wrapped in blankets, while Walter drove through water reaching halfway up the rear wheels. Dean Holloway saw it happen. Saw the old tractor dragging vehicles heavier than itself. Saw Walter steering calmly through currents that made pickup trucks slide sideways. Dean's own truck stalled 20 minutes later. Water rushed through the doors almost immediately. He tried restarting the engine. Nothing. Then the truck shifted, just slightly. The current was moving it. Dean climbed onto the hood, while freezing water surged around his legs. Rain stung his face. Somewhere nearby, a propane tank exploded with a dull boom that echoed across town. For the first time that night, Dean Holloway looked frightened. Then he heard the Farmall. Low engine noise. Slow. Steady. Closer every second. Walter stopped beside him. "You planning to sit there till Arkansas?" Walter asked. Dean climbed down without speaking. The old farmer handed him a chain. Together, they hooked the truck to the rear drawbar. The Farmall strained. Mud churned. Water pushed hard against the tires. Then the tractor moved forward. An inch. Then 2. Then the truck came free. Dean stared at the machine like he was seeing it for the first time. Have you ever known you were wrong while the evidence stood directly in front of you? Not embarrassed wrong. Not small wrong. The kind of wrong that changes the way you see another human being. That was what happened to Dean Holloway, standing knee-deep in floodwater beside an old red tractor he once mocked. The rescue efforts continued until nearly dawn. Walter never hurried, never panicked. He simply worked. At 4:18 a.m., they reached the Simmons family trapped inside a farmhouse near Dry Creek. Water had already reached the porch roof. Dean wanted to wait for the National Guard boats arriving from Hillsboro. Walter shook his head. House won't last another hour. Dean looked at the current. You can't drive through that. Walter tightened his gloves. Watch me. The Farmall entered the water slowly. Current slammed against the front axle. The engine growled deeper. For a moment, the headlights disappeared completely beneath spray. Dean thought the tractor was finished. Then it emerged again. Still moving. Still pulling. Walter reached the Simmons house just before the back wall collapsed into flood. By sunrise, 23 people owed their lives to that old tractor and the man driving it. And Dean Holloway had stopped laughing, but the river was still rising. Morning arrived gray and cold over Jefferson County. What remained of the town looked unfamiliar. Boats drifted where pickup trucks normally parked. Fence posts barely showed above muddy water. Feed sacks floated against storefront windows. Entire sections of Main Street sat underwater beneath a current carrying lumber, propane tanks, branches, and pieces of somebody's porch swing. The official river gauge near Burnsville recorded a rise of almost 13 feet overnight. Walter had missed his estimate by less than 1 foot. National Guard trucks rolled into town shortly after sunrise, while exhausted deputies guided rescue crews through flooded neighborhoods. Reporters arrived from St. Louis before noon. They wanted photographs of destroyed roads and damaged homes. Instead, they found people talking about an old farmer and a tractor built before Elvis Presley recorded his first song. Dean Holloway followed Walter back to the farm around 10 in the morning. The rain had slowed by then, though water still covered most low fields. Walter parked the Farmall beside the equipment shed and shut the engine down carefully. Only then did Dean notice how tired the old man looked. Walter climbed off the tractor slowly, favoring his bad leg. His coat was soaked. His hands trembled from cold, but his eyes remained steady. "Coffee's inside," he said. That kitchen had not changed much since 1958. Green cabinets, worn oak table, cast iron skillet hanging above the stove. Eleanor Grady had died from cancer in 1981, but the house still carried traces of her everywhere. Hand-sewn curtains, recipe cards, a jar of peppermints beside the sink. Dean sat quietly while Walter poured coffee. Finally, he asked a question that had followed him all night. "How did you know?" Walter stared through the window toward the flooded pasture. "The river told me." Dean almost laughed again. Almost. But he had spent the night watching the impossible become real. So instead, he listened. "Let me tell you about the big river." The river changed constantly, but not randomly. Old farmers learned patterns from decades of watching soil, insects, cloud color, wind direction, and animal behavior. Walter noticed the smell first that afternoon. Floodwater carries a different odor when upstream ground saturates too quickly. Then came the birds flying lower than usual. Then the silence from frogs. Then the pressure in his left knee where wartime shrapnel still rested near the bone. People call those things superstition because they cannot be measured neatly, but experience is measurement too. Dean lowered his eyes. "I laughed at you." Walter nodded once. "You did." "I'm sorry." Walter sipped coffee. Most men learn slower than rivers. Outside, helicopters crossed overhead toward town. The county declared a state of emergency that afternoon. Damage estimates climbed past $11 million within 48 hours. More than 100 homes suffered major flooding. Yet not a single resident from Walter's rescue route died during the storm. News spread quickly. Reporters wanted interviews. Walter refused most of them. He did agree to one short conversation with a St. Louis television station. The reporter asked why he trusted an old tractor during conditions that stopped newer vehicles. Walter rested one hand on the Farmall's hood. "Because it never lied to me." The clip aired across Missouri that evening. People loved it. Dean watched from his office downtown. Then he did something nobody expected. 3 days after the flood, Dean Holloway stood during a county planning meeting and publicly admitted Walter Grady had warned them hours before the disaster. The room went silent. Dean cleared his throat. "We should have listened." No excuses. No blaming weather forecasts. No protecting his reputation. Just honesty. That mattered, because redemption only means something when pride costs you something first. Have you ever owned something everybody else called outdated? Something slow, heavy, old-fashioned, only to discover later that durability matters more than appearances? That question stayed with many people after the flood, especially Dean. He returned to Walter's farm several times that summer. Sometimes they repaired fences. Sometimes they cleared debris from washed-out fields. Sometimes they simply sat near the equipment shed talking about weather, machinery, and how quickly modern people confuse convenience with wisdom. One evening in August, Dean asked whether Walter ever planned to replace the Farmall. Walter smiled faintly. With what? Dean laughed, not mockingly this time, respectfully. By September, most floodwater had receded. Crops were ruined across large portions of the county. But rebuilding had already begun. Volunteers repaired homes. Churches organized food drives. Mechanics worked overtime restoring damaged engines. And every few days, people still saw Walter Grady driving that red Farmall across muddy fields like nothing in the world had changed. Then, late one October evening, Dean arrived at Walter's farm carrying a folder from the county planning board. What he proposed next would change the entire valley forever. The proposal Dean Holloway carried onto Walter Grady's porch in October of 1987 was only 14 pages long, but it eventually changed Jefferson County forever. Dean wanted to redesign the floodplain, not with expensive studies written by consultants from Chicago or Kansas City, with local knowledge, real knowledge, the kind carried by farmers who had watched the same ground for 50 years. Walter listened quietly while Dean explained the idea. New elevation restrictions near the river, better drainage channels, emergency warning systems controlled locally instead of waiting for distant offices. Most importantly, Dean wanted older farmers involved in every decision. You really think they'll listen? Walter asked. Dean nodded slowly. They listened after the flood. And they did. Over the next 3 years, Jefferson County rebuilt roads farther from low ground and improved drainage along vulnerable sections of the valley. Local farmers helped map flood behavior based on decades of observation. Emergency evacuation procedures changed completely. The county never experienced another disaster on that scale. Dean Holloway changed too. He stopped mocking old equipment, stopped assuming technology automatically meant wisdom. In 1991, he bought a used 1952 John Deere model, our diesel tractor from a retired farmer near Hillsboro, and spent 2 winters restoring it with Walter inside the equipment shed. The machine produced 48 horsepower and weighed nearly 7,000 pounds with loaded rear tires. Dean learned how to rebuild carburetors, adjust valves, grease bearings, and repair wiring by hand instead of replacing entire systems. Walter never praised him much, just nodded when work was done correctly. For men like Walter, that meant everything. Let me tell you about the final years of Walter Grady. He kept farming into his late 70s, even after arthritis stiffened his hands. Neighbors often saw him walking slowly through soybean rows before sunrise carrying the same dented thermos he owned since the Eisenhower administration. He still wore cracked leather boots repaired 3 different times by a cobbler in Festus. And every spring, before planting began, he started the Farmall M, always the same way. Fuel valve first, throttle halfway, 2 pumps on the choke. Then the starter. The engine almost always fired within seconds. Children from town occasionally visited the farm on school trips after the flood became part of local history. Walter rarely gave speeches. He simply placed small hands against the tractor's steel body and explained how machines lasted longer when people respected them. Eleanor's old kitchen remained unchanged until the end. Same curtains, same table, same peppermints near the sink. Walter Grady died peacefully in February of 1998 after a short illness. He was 83 years old. More than 400 people attended the funeral despite freezing rain. Dean Holloway spoke briefly during the service. His voice cracked halfway through. He tried to warn us, Dean said. Most of us were too proud to hear him. After Walter's death, the farm passed to his daughter, Ruth and Grady Mercer, who continued leasing portions of the land for corn and soybeans. But she never sold the equipment shed, especially not the Farmall. That tractor still runs. Every April, during the county flood preparedness fair established after the disaster in 1987, Dean Holloway drives a restored Farmall M through town at the head of the parade. People wave. Children point. Older residents remember. And when the engine passes slowly beneath the bridge near Platten Creek, there's always a moment when the crowd becomes strangely quiet, because they remember that night, the rain, the laughter, the water, and the old farmer who listened carefully enough to hear the river speaking before anybody else did. Years later, A reporter once asked Dean what changed him most during the flood. He thought about the question a long time. Then he answered honestly. It wasn't the tractor, he said. It was how calm Walter stayed while everybody else needed him. That answer spread because people understood it immediately. Machines matter. Experience matters. But calm competence during disaster matters most of all. The Farmall eventually became more than machinery. It became memory made visible. Steel shaped into proof that endurance still has value in a world addicted to replacing things too quickly. And maybe that was always the real lesson buried beneath the floodwater. Some knowledge cannot be downloaded. Some wisdom only arrives after 40 years of watching the same sky. Some things survive because they were built slowly by people who expected hardship instead of convenience. He never raised his voice. He never had to. The river, the storm, and the old machine said everything for him. If you knew someone like Walter Grady, somebody who stayed calm while everyone else panicked, somebody who kept old equipment alive long after others called it obsolete, tell me about them in the comments. I read every story. And if you want to hear about the Kansas farmer who buried a 1938 case tractor beneath hay bales for 9 years, so the bank could not repossess it during the drought in 1956, that story is coming soon. You will want to be here for that one.